Today on The Sociologist, we're talking about American social media influencers, their effects and affects by Russian propaganda, conspiracy theories, and the history of social engineering, particularly through the lens of Russian conspiracy and propaganda, not just in their homeland, but around the globe as well. So recently, an American company, Tenet Media Group in Nashville, Tennessee, was accused by the Department of Justice of funneling tens of millions of dollars funded by Russian assets to social media influencers that are American, speaking to largely American audiences. These include people like Tim Pool, Dave Rubin, Benny Johnson, Lauren Southern as well. So this is a very much developing information that we're getting about some of the social conspiracies, some of the cultural impacts, some of the espionage and spy novels we had always seen in movies and television or heard about during the Red Scare and the Cold War is very much alive and kicking today. So looking back, Russians have a long history of sociocultural engineering and propaganda. The terms for this of a useful idiot, using somebody that already has the direction you want to go to push them, to push whatever values, ideas, and actions into a social space, before you even got in touch with them with whatever propaganda, whatever goals, whatever outside bodies you were wanting, goes back to the 1860s. The Russians had a term for useful fools, politsnie duraki, and it was used to refer to, at the time, Russian nihilists that were so fed up with the system they believed nothing would work, and anarchism would be the only government that is preferable to the czarists of the time. They also used this, though, to apply to the apologists, to the people that were pro-Russian oligarchy, for the Russian royals that were hoarding all of the wealth of the country and letting the smaller working classes to die. Now, both of these can be very useful in propaganda because they may be able to be directed with the extremism of their values. Up through 1947, Austrian-American economist Ludwig von Mises wrote a book called Planned Chaos, in which he also was the first one to coin the term useful idiots in propaganda. So in the first half of the 20th century, after the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin had a surplus of cash coming from the Tsarist gold reserves that was confiscated during the Russian Revolution from the Tsars, from the Russian oligarchy, the bourgeoisie ruling class that had been in place up until the Revolution. What to do with this then? The Communist International was an organization that had run for a couple decades in the first part of the 20th century that was operating to spread goodwill for Russia, to build alliances and allegiances with the Soviet Union, as well as resources, agreements, trades, and ideas and information, as well as intelligence assets to and from Mother Russia, for Vladimir Lenin. The Communist International was very good at social engineering. They found very quickly, and Vladimir Lenin also adopted these beliefs, that it is much harder to go into an outside culture, society, group of any kind, and get them to change their beliefs, their thoughts, their actions, and their values. Rather, you locate the members in that society, in that group, that already align with your goals. The Communist Political Party even operated here in the United States for a number of decades, finding people that are sympathetic to your goals. If not the same values, if not the same language, culture, or anything else, these are the useful idiots that the Communist International would find and then be able to fund with millions of dollars, rubles, marks, pounds, whatever the currency that had been flushed from the fall of the Russian oligarchy back in the Russian Revolution. They're flush with cash, but now we need some ideas, we need support, we need some social engineering. The Communist International, under Vladimir Lenin, also had 21 agreements, 21 tenets that a country would have to agree with and uphold for their membership to Russia's resources, to this money, to be able to have the support of the Russian power machine. They had been a superpower for decades. So Russian operatives would use these cash injections, use this incentivization to be able to find the people useful to them to either uphold certain governments and government ideals in certain countries or help overthrow them, all the way from organizations and institutions down to political parties, down to religious groups, down to individuals and journalists. These were people with loud voices in the community that could be swayed, and they're going to have a much bigger microphone when they have millions of dollars backing them. During the Cold War, some of the most famous Russian spies and useful idiots that we had found here on American soil were people such as Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were American citizens, members of the Communist Party. They were tried and found guilty and executed for treason and espionage back in the 50s, all the way up to as recently as the 1990s. A gentleman by the name of Aldrich Ames was a high-level CIA operator that was not just spying and passing U.S. information back to Russia, because he, as an American citizen, had spent his entire life here with American ears, American eyes, an American accent, an American social security number, but he also had an American voice. Use that to work up to higher levels of the CIA, and then providing misinformation, disinformation, and bad intelligence to the United States of America government, as well as the Department of Defense. Now, this is a radically different way we think about espionage and spycraft than just, getting the file, getting photos, bugging, and listening to information. It's also very useful to have an active voice behind enemy lines and to sow dissent, disinformation, and conflict. This social engineering continued all the way up until the 2014 invasion and annexation of Crimea. So in Crimea, it was very apparent that the Russians were using social engineering. They employ factories of psychiatrists, psychologists, sociologists, and political scientists to be able to track, in the age of the internet, certain patterns, certain symptoms, certain behaviors, influence that someone may have to apply their craft to this person as a target audience member or potentially useful idiot. So this can be things like the hashtags you use, the people you follow, the people you comment back with, the people that you fight with online, the forums that you see, the amount of screen time and at what times of day you have. All of these are factors that go over years to be able to determine how useful somebody may be to these outside influences. In Crimea and in cybersecurity, this is also called social engineering because man is and always will be the weakest link in intelligence. So through this social media footprint, through your algorithm, through your social media profile, these Russian operators will be able to customize certain patterns of what would be useful to you? Who would you believe? Where would you believe it from? Do you read it? Do you watch it? Do you watch podcasts? Where do you get your information? How would you digest it most readily to be able to be a mark, a target audience for this propaganda? It was said that man is the weakest link in the chain of information technology. Man is also the most fallible point in social structures, in institutions, in establishments, organizations. Man is also the weakest link in social group communication as well. The people that have the most followers, they are most readily to be targeted by the leader of that group, by the loudest voices, by those that are seen and heard by the most amounts of people. This is why these social media influencers in 2024, Tim Pool, Lauren Southern, Dave Rubin, Benny Johnson, had huge social media followers, and they were selected very particularly by Tenet Media to be able to inject some of this Russian money and finance into flexing their arms. The unwitting innocence, the useful fools of this comes in the form of these people have had these voices, these views for a very long time. They've had established podcasts, established thoughts, established beliefs that predated Tenet Media by a long time. So in Tenet Media, an American company comes to you and offers you $100,000 for each video you make, just to keep espousing the same messages that you have been, to keep championing the same ideologies, to keep echoing the same messaging that you already have been. That is a sign it may be aligned with propagandastic endeavors outside yourself. Those ideas you have, yes, they may be your ideas, but they also can be useful to other people opposed to your own well-being, this unwitting participant in their own destruction. So what can we do to defend ourselves against the social engineering at hand that is outside of our own best interests, outside of our own awareness? What can we do to inoculate ourselves against some of these conspiracies, as well as protect ourselves from some of the propaganda that we know to be out there as well? So we do have the political topics as well as the target audiences put forth by Tenet Media. So we know the talking points, we know the things that these propagandastic entities are wanting us to think about, wanting us to worry about, wanting us to devalue certain groups of people. The more of these boxes we may check in our social media diet, the more of these topics we recognize as being something day in and day out, something that's a very hot button issue on your favorite social media platform, your favorite podcast host, concerns raised at the local PTA meetings. These are aligned with motivators and drivers that may be outside of us. So the more we are aware of our social media diet and how much in common our diet and what we consume, what we see on a regular basis has in common with these propaganda topics, we can know maybe we venture outside of that to get some new talking points, some new points of view, and some new topics outside of the things aligned currently with a propaganda attack and efforts in the US. A recent survey as well of American voters determined that not everyone is very confident in their ability to spot AI and deepfake images, very visceral, very photojournalistic points of propaganda and misinformation, disinformation confidently. This study did tend to skew towards Republican. All of a sudden, we're back to these superstitious times of Fae and Fae folk. Let me count your fingers. How many fingers do you have on your hands? How many R's in the word strawberry before I let you into my house? Knowing more of these tools and knowing how to spot AI in particular as well as propaganda gives us a lot better nose to sniff out ideations, goals, motivations, and drivers that may not be ours. So these campaign topics that we were able to uncover by Tenet Media, again, an outside influence coming into U.S. politics and the sociocultural sphere through social media influencers, if we hear these topics and they are in lockstep with a particular media group, with a particular podcaster, with a particular influencer, with that one guy at work, with the crazy uncle that you try to avoid at Thanksgiving. These are symptoms of propaganda that we may be able to start to recognize in ourselves, in others as well. These campaign topics included encroaching universal poverty. If people are telling you to be afraid that you're going to be poor, that you're not going to be able to make money. Record inflation, if inflation is a hot button keyword on your favorite news station as well. Halting of economic growth, being concerned with the economy, stressing about the economy. Unaffordable prices in food and essential goods, being told that bread is becoming unaffordable. Housing is unaffordable. These are valid stressors. We may have personal anecdotes with things like these talking points to be concerned with in our personal lives. This is merely one point in this constellation that is a pattern of propaganda. So let's move on to some of the other topics. Risk of job loss specifically for white Americans. Anyone telling you that people are not hiring white Americans or not hiring you because you're white, being the majority race now is a deficit to you. In addition to that, privileges for the disabled and people of color. This goes into the DEI codification as well, using DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion concepts and practices as a scary talking point. If that is something you are stressed about, if you have a negative association to those terms, to those topics, this is a propaganda point as well. Again, not something that is necessarily bad to be on your mind, to be on the consciousness of the zeitgeist of America right now, but it is in common with this pattern of a targeted attack on our thoughts, on our ideas, on our values. Another campaign talking point by Tenet Media was the constant lies of the Democratic administration about the real situation going on in this country. This also does inject some value into the exclusivity of information. Oh, if you really know what's going on, oh, well, they won't tell you what's really going on behind the scenes. This lets you in on a little secret. It's only for members. If you really care what's going on, if you're a real patriot, oh, if you really are awake to what's going on, really aware of it. This is a great way to incentivize learning more and getting in on this exclusivity of knowledge. However, once you go behind those closed doors, that's a much smaller group. It becomes much easier to become a victim of propaganda when in a very small group of influence. Another talking point they have is fear of crime coming from immigrants and people of color. This is also including immigrants from Ukraine now. So it's no longer a simply whites versus non-white issue in America. They're extending this to all immigrants. America, the land of immigrants, American, where you go to make your dreams come true. America, the nation built by immigrants, built for immigrants, built to come here and chase your dreams. More of these topics. Overspending on foreign policy at the expense of interests of white U.S. citizens. So being concerned with foreign spending money in foreign wars, investing in other cultures and other organizations, institutions outside the U.S. This concern is a talking point of these Russian propagandists as well. We have the constant lies to voters by the Democratic Party that currently is in power. This sows dissent and distrust in the institutions in play. Distrust in institutions currently is at a global high. This includes Democrats and Republicans, everyone from every political spectrum, as well as ideologies from around the world. Currently, we don't trust government bodies. We don't trust politics or politicians. We don't trust the large corporations. We don't trust the cops. Everyone everywhere seems to be having this growing idea of distrust and dissent in institutions, the social structures in place. Last but not least, America suffering defeat despite the Democratic administration's attempts. Our guys will be drawn into Ukraine and our soldiers will die in Ukraine. This talking point drives on a lot of fear. Fear is a fantastic motivator and driver for changing your thinking, changing your beliefs, and taking action. These judgments driven by fear of very visceral things, of war, of conflict, that are topical because they're happening right now, and we can see the conflict and the devastation of war in places like Ukraine and Gaza as well. This is a very forefront fear in the minds of Americans that is being weaponized to definitely point this distrust, point this stress in one particular direction. So we also got the target audience of this propaganda campaign by Tenet Media. These target audience members let us know if we are a high risk factor for this propaganda. We know if we are a high risk, high value target for this propaganda and these beliefs, these values, these ideas to be instilled. So we may want to be able to check them. So these groups include Republican voters, Donald Trump supporters, supporters of traditional family values, key word to keep an eye out for when we're sussing out propaganda, as well as lower and middle income white Americans. These are working class Americans. These are the blue collar people that some claim to support. So let's take care, check ourselves, check each other, our families and friends for these talking points, these topics. If people are worried about these topics, they may be subject to these propaganda endeavors and these propaganda techniques, these social engineering structures that other people outside of ourselves are trying to decide our values, our beliefs, and our actions. We are protecting our countrymen from these attacks on ideas, values, culture that we have in this sociological engineering. Now, again, this goes back hundreds of years. The history of this leads back to the 1860s with the spawning of the Russian Revolution, all the way up into the Communist International, all the way through the Cold War. The Cold War may not have ended, but the battlefield may have changed.